My name is Tom Johnson, and I was the Hennepin County Attorney, elected for the first time in 1978 and served through 1990. Quite a while ago now, but but it was a time of a lot of exciting things happening. And of course, one of the most exciting was the awareness that developed around the sexual abuse of children, and taking that awareness to a level of being able to actually hold people accountable within the criminal justice system for that kind of abuse. And then obviously, and most importantly, and that's where Touch comes in, engaging in preventative outreach to children, and giving them the skills to know when to say no, or when to run. And that was, the combination of those two things, being able to successfully hold people accountable on one hand, and on the other hand to be engaged in this very widespread and very successful prevention effort was, that was the late 70s, early 80s, and it was a dynamite time. It was very difficult in those early years. The police did, the primary investigation. They had no clue how to interview a child. I remember the officers, detectives in the homicide division did the interviewing of children who may have been sexually abused, and their office was this huge cavernous room in the basement of City Hall, and you'd walk in there and these booming voices and big guys, they were almost all guys, would be working away, and the child would be brought to some detective's desk, sat down in a steel chair, and the detective would say, "Well, tell me what happened." That's about it. I mean, they had no clue how to go about having a discussion that was not a leading discussion, wasn't planting any ideas, but was getting information that needed to be got. They just didn't get any information. And then back in those days, you had the child brought to many different places, from the police to child protection to the hospital, and they were constantly being interviewed with people with very different levels of skills, and not nowhere near having a common language or any real language that a child would understand to elicit information. And so you'd wind up with very inconsistent statements from the child, and so it would make a successful prosecution very difficult. I remember when first becoming aware of the Touch program and the work that was being done at Illusion Theater, and just thinking, wow, this is groundbreaking. We need to be a part of that, because it has the potential to be life-saving and for a lot of children. And I have no doubt, but that's exactly what it was, life-saving for a lot of children. Life-saving in the sense maybe not of a murder homicide, but life-saving in the sense of having a child avoid the torture of being sexually abused that will impact their lives for their entire life. The work that you folks did with Touch in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, showing that there was a language that you could use, that there was a way to communicate with, that allowed you to communicate with children, to get information that was not, information that was planted or in any way shaped by how you were talking about this. And so you had, the Touch program, which, was primarily a prevention program, also, showing certainly us, and I think a lot of the world, that unlike the way in which a homicide detective might approach a child, there were different ways. There was a better way, and a way that was much more respectful of the child, much less damaging to the child, but also much more likely to elicit the truth in terms of what actually did happen. Was the child abused, and if so, how did it happen? In the child's own words, and that was critical. The teachings that went along with the Touch program are now very embedded, yes, but that doesn't mean that they don't continue to be a value. And I think it's a value at multiple levels, starting obviously with the fact that I think the preventive skills, the self-awareness skills that that kids are taught through the program, I have no doubt, but it has prevented untold numbers of kids from being sexually abused. Wonderful. So that's first and foremost, and I think that continues. I mean, you always have young kids who aren't going to know necessarily the difference between what's happening here. Is this doesn't feel right? But it's an uncle, it's a father. I mean, it's got to they know what's best for me or whatever, and without the training that they get, that's through the Touch program, and they're so vulnerable. So that's, I think, the most dramatic of the values that still continue. But then you move on to the fact that the child protection, criminal justice system has absorbed much of that language and use that language, are comfortable with it. I don't know where it came from necessarily anymore, but it's there, it's doing its job, it's working. I think that that while I may have mentioned this before, but while the principal purpose of Touch was about prevention, by making kids aware that there are certain types of touch that wasn't appropriate, that in and of itself resulted in some kids coming out of a dangerous situation that they would have otherwise continued to reside in. So these are very significant points of value that I think are still very much in play today. It would have been probably 1981, 82, when we formed a unit within the county attorney's office, the Child Sexual Abuse Prosecution Unit, and that was done in response to the fact that more cases were surfacing. We could get successful prosecutions. We wanted to, make sure that the attorneys that were prosecuting those cases were well trained, that they were understood the most recent developments, tools that could be used to prosecute these cases. And so we limited it to a relatively small number. I think there's probably 4 or 5 lawyers that were in that unit. And in part it was that these cases take a long time to work up, and we wanted to reduce the caseload for those attorneys so we could aggressively prosecute them.
Do you remember who was the head of that, or is there?
I know Pam Alexander was on the team. I think she headed it up. If I played a little bit of a leadership role here, how did that come about? Well, it came about because of the tools that I was given, and those tools, came from not entirely, but largely from the touch and the language, and being able to see that kids were being hurt, and we can root it out, and we've got a moral obligation to do that. The development of the Touch program and the language that went with it was just of immense value to kids, to adults, to caregivers, and then to the justice system. Not written in stone someplace that in the late 70s, we're going to find a language to talk to children about good and bad touch. But it did happen, and it happened because you had the foresight to see the value in that, a community that had some history in not necessarily this field, but analogous fields, not child sexual abuse, but sexual abuse involving adults. And so it got him picked up pretty quickly. I mean, when you think about going from, it doesn't exist to, okay, now we know how to talk about it within a decade, really. As social change occurs, that's a very short period of time. It was really understood that we had just gone through this remarkable breakthrough in terms of how to communicate with kids, both primarily on a preventative basis, but that by virtue of that communication, there were cases where a child would say, I've been abused. So it was serving both of those purposes. And the language that you were using began to then infiltrate the justice system, including the child protection system and the social protection network, and that here in Minnesota, and that we could talk about when we went nationally about it.